Hey everyone, Jason Long here with Brainleaf, and today we're going to be talking about what goes into defining the project when you're building your statement of work or your scope of work for a website. So we're going to be looking at the different parts of defining goals, defining objectives, etc., that are all going to play in to building out the full scope of work. So let's take a look at that today. All right, so we're going to get started with remembering what's important. So when you're defining clear, measurable goals for a website, you got to remember why you're building this thing. So you're building it, or a website or web application, or really anything, but in this case, we're talking about a website or an application. So when you're building it, you got to remember what's important. At the end of the day, a website is only doing a handful of things. It's bringing in leads, it's making sales, it's delivering a message. That's it. That's all. If you're building an app, maybe you've got some, there's so many things that an app can do because it's delivering a ton of different things. But at the end of the day, if somebody's building an app, they're probably wanting to make money, deliver a message, or sell a product, right? So you got to remember why you're doing this and what's important. And so when you're setting your goals, you have to set your goals around that. So that means that you're generally going to be setting something like a sales goal or a marketing goal, like increasing the number of leads from this side, from X to Y, increasing the number of leads, of sales, of products sold, all of these different things. And when you're setting that, it's important to also set goals around the time, because if you're trying to rank a website up, your website, it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take months or sometimes a year, maybe more, to rank that site up. So if you're ranking it up or you're trying to just deliver the message better or whatever it is, you need to make sure that you have that timeline as well. So, and that, you've got the sales goals, ranking goals. Message delivery goals is a little bit more difficult because it's going to be how many people saw the thing, how were they converted to either a user or a believer or whatever the thing is. But still, when you're defining the project, you need to define what that is and how long it's going to take, and make sure you're really clear to your customers about what these things are and how long it's going to take to accomplish them. So remember, it's going to be, what is it? How are we doing it? When is it going to be done? How much is it going to cost? And you can also think about things like SMART goals. So those are specific, measurable, attainable, realistic, and timely. Pretty much all the stuff we just said, except we didn't mention realistic and attainable. But if you're building a website, I assume it's going to be realistic and attainable. So in your creative brief, or whatever document it is you're using to define the project for your scope of work, you need to have all of these goals listed out. Next, you're going to define things like brand and use of color and messaging. So you have to make sure that your team connects the objectives to the creative strategies. So you've got all these goals you just put together, but now you have to figure out, and you have to define, what are the creative strategies that meet these goals? And what do we think the impact of these creative strategies are going to be? So, I'm sure, most of the time a company's already got a brand and has got the general messaging put together, but you have to help them define or more clearly define in your scope of work that use of color, that use of messaging. Where are you going to be putting different things? Like for this kind of user, you're putting this kind of message here, and that kind of user, that kind of message over here. And then, you can get into things like A/B testing and multivariate testing, et cetera, to see if those things work. But when you're first planning it out and you're building your scope of work or statement of work, you have to write those things down so it's really clear. And that applies also to some extent to the UI. That's the user interface. Like, how do things look? Are you targeting an older crowd or a younger crowd, more tech-savvy crowd, a less tech-savvy crowd? You have to know these things to determine how you're going to build your UI. It's really important. So make sure that you're connecting those goals with your creative strategies. And then the other thing, really important on creative strategies, you have to consider things like compliance. specifically things like ADA compliance. That's Americans with Disabilities Act compliance. If you don't take that into account, and then your customer has to have the site ADA compliant, you're going to have to rebuild a bunch of stuff. So don't do that. So ADA compliant, and then also other kinds of compliance like PCI compliance or HIPAA compliance. You have to know what you can and can't do when you're building the system, and it needs to be stated in your scope of work. So, all right, so that's that. The next thing you're going to do is you're going to build a team consensus. When you're building a team consensus for your scope of work or statement of work for your website, that means you're going to have your team is going to understand everything that's going on, and your client's team is going to understand everything that's going on. It's not just you, it's both sides coming together. Both sides have to understand what it is you're doing, what are these strategies, how do they work, how are we going to implement them, what are the goals, what are the objectives, what are the measurements, how do we know it's successful. And so we didn't talk that much a minute ago about measurements, but for each one of these things, for each one of these pieces, you have to put together how you're measuring those things. You know, what is the actual goal? How do you define success? And then finally, you have to align expectations in that team consensus. That's going to be timelines, milestones, payments. What if something is out of scope? What if they come back and they ask you for something that's not in your scope of work? What happens, you know, like you got to let them know, like, okay, that's cool. It's going to push your timeline back. It's going to push the cost up. It's going to, you know, how are we going to change these things? What can be done? What can't be done? Generally, all of this stuff is in your contract, but you have to make sure that you additionally tell people, because otherwise, how will they know? So when you're defining your goals, when you're planning out your scope of work, these are the first steps. And this doesn't include your information architecture. This doesn't include all the other things. And generally, all of this stuff is put into a creative brief. And there's a little bit more here and there that goes into the creative brief, but those are the main things that go in there. So I hope this is helpful. Thank you guys so much. I'll talk to you soon.